All right. Woo. Voice of God. Our first stop. Whoop. A little echoey. All right, our first stop on the tour is the Pedestrian Bridge that goes across the Crosse River. At the north end of the bridge, it used to be the Mobile oil site. That area is the oldest and most well-documented haunted area in the city of La Crosse. The stories of its hauntings go all the way back to 1882. So in 1882, there was a large railroad yard on the south end of that bridge. Several lines came down to 2, and then that bridge was the only thoroughfare that took engines and cars across the La Crosse River. Once it got on the north end of the bridge, it opened up into another large railroad yard, and there was a large grain elevator on the banks of the Black River. 1882, the La Crosse newspaper, the La Crosse Chronicle, runs several stories of strange things being seen down here. The first article appears on November 17th. And the article starts out saying, everyone in town is talking about this, but we are going to print this up in case somebody missed it. And then it went on to describe all the strange things people had been seeing down there. The first story that they told was that of a brakeman who was coupling cars in that railroad yard late at night. This is a photograph of the pins and the links that were in between railroad cars at that time. And this guy had that big, heavy steel pin in his hand. He told the paper that he was about to put it in place into the last car of a string of 9. Before he could do that, he told the paper that an invisible hand overtook his, wrenching that heavy pin from his hand, and then disappearing. He told the paper he did not drop it, he did not accidentally throw it. The pin was just gone. And then the engine pulls away, he discovered all the pins he had just put in place were now missing. In that same article, they shared an event that had happened a couple of weeks earlier. 5 men were standing by the grain elevator on the banks of the Black River, and they said from a distance of well over 100 yards, they saw somebody they could not identify, a stranger, walking along one of the tracks. All 5 of these guys began to shout at him because they could see there was an engine bearing down on him, and he wasn't getting off the line. The conductor driving the train, he saw someone on the track as well. He threw on the brakes, but those steam engines don't exactly stop on a dime. So these 5 guys at the grain elevator, they see this guy get hit. They see him crumple under the wheels of the engine. They said even from that distance, they could hear bones crunching. So they all run to the side of the accident. That engine finally stops. The engineer, the fireman gets out, and there is nothing there. And then in that same, so that's November 17th. And then on November 18th, the paper runs another story. This time they told of a conductor who was in his cab late at night. He said suddenly it got sharply colder, and then a mist drifted in behind him. He then heard a voice say, "We need an engine and 2 cars to take us up, up." I say the last one like that on purpose, because the paper said the last one came out between a shriek and a groan. And that was my best shriek and a groan. So that is the 18th. No article on the 19th. November 20th, the paper runs another story. And this article was pretty much saying, please stop coming down here. The citizens of La Crosse were really curious after those first 2 articles. And now they were coming down there late at night, large groups, everyone hoping to catch a glimpse of the railway ghost, which is what everyone in town was now calling it. They made an example out of Samuel Stoller. He was from southern Minnesota. And the paper wrote that Sam arrived down here armed with a belly full of whiskey, a club, and a lantern. I think Sammy was going to do some ghost busting, but he was thrown in jail, and it was reported he was fined a whopping $5. So yes, fines that huge, people weren't going to come down here anymore. So that's 1882. 2 years later, 1884, another newspaper, the Crosse Republican Leader, ran their story of strange things being seen in that area. They wrote of people seeing a shimmering, floating specter that creeped along the iron rails late at night, whose clothing would appear and disappear as if the night winds had held them in their keeping. That's 1884. Now, as far as contemporary stories, I could not find much. Some of you may know, up until about 8 years ago, you weren't allowed to cross that bridge because the north end of that bridge was private property. And then 8 years ago, they opened it up as a bike and a pedestrian path, and that's the only thing that's on the north end of that bridge right now. Some of you may know that it's changing very quickly. They are developing a new neighborhood called River Point. There'll be retail and commercial and residential buildings on that end of the bridge. I'll be real interested to find out if ghost stories pop up with those new buildings. And I will be checking, so you can have me back and I'll report that to you. All right, from that area, we walk down to the Freight House restaurant. There's the Freight House, and I want to show you what it looked like before it became a restaurant in 1979. They had some work to do. And this is the Freight House around 1880. So you can see, here's the restaurant here in the photograph. You see that water right here? So the Mississippi River was just on the other side of where the CenturyLink building is today. They added Riverside Park in 1913. They took river dredge to put the land there. So the river was much closer to us back then than it is today. So I spoke with John Erickson. He's one of the owners and managers at the Freight House, and he told me some great stories. He told me when he first started working there, a woman came in during the daytime. He said she had really wild white hair, and she came in. She said, someone gave me a gift certificate, but I can't eat here. So can I use this for a hat or a t-shirt or something? And he said, of course. And he went to go get her things. He came back to her, and she said to him, this place is nice. Food smells great, but I can't eat here because you have way too many renters. So John asked what she meant by that. And she said, well, there is one standing on the landing above the dining room right now. John turned around. There was no one up there. She then told him that a gentleman with a bowler hat had just walked through the reception area. He knew there was no way that could be true, so he dismissed it. But then a couple of months later, he had two University of Wisconsin lacrosse students on his cleaning crew, and they were in the upstairs restrooms. So if you're familiar with the upstairs of the Freight House, there is a small bar up there. It's connected with a meeting room. Sometimes they use it for overflow dining. And then just off to the right of the bar, there are some restrooms. So these guys are in these restrooms. It's about 3 o'clock in the morning. They were the only two people in the building and have been the only two people in the building for several hours. I was told that when these guys worked, they would crank music really, really loud. But even over their loud music, they heard a voice behind them say, "Daddy?" They turned around, and there was a little girl standing in the doorway. She was about 8 years old, and she was wearing a white dress. As soon as her eyes met hers, she took a step back, and the bathroom door slowly closed. When these two guys stopped freaking out, they searched the entire building, found nothing, and John told me they both called on Monday and quit. and then they never came get their last paycheck. He had to mail that to them eventually. I interviewed lots of staff at the freight house, and one wait staff told me she was working and she went to go check those upstairs restrooms. As she started to open the door, a voice from inside said very sharply, "Get out." So she quickly shut the door. She never left the area. She continued to wait outside the door. She waited for quite a while. Then she decided she better go back in, thinking that there could be a medical emergency. She checked the bathroom again, and there was no one in there. So the freight house really was a freight house. Passengers were not dropped off there. Passengers were dropped off at the train station at 3rd and J Street, which is where our bus station is today. The freight house saw lots of freight, boxes, nothing that's particularly interesting. So when we get into the archives, we don't find a lot of names associated with the place. So we're not really sure who the ghosts are at the freight house, but we do hear stories of their antics from the staff at the freight house. Okay, from the freight house, we walk up to Dell's bar. As you can see, it's since 1933, that's when Dell's opened up. That's right after they repealed Prohibition. But the story of that as a tavern goes back much farther than that. This is 3rd Street. Around 1890, you can see the railroad tracks going right down the middle of the street. And take a particular look at this archway right here. That archway is still there. It's part of express printing, is the business that's there. And then you can see this is the awning that belonged to the saloon that was on the corner there. So that corner has been a saloon or a tavern since really the very beginning of La Crosse's history. The only time it wasn't a tavern was during Prohibition. Many local historians believe their street is safe. They always were a tavern, even during Prohibition. The business that was there sold soft drinks, apparently. Dell's is famous for their Bloody Marys. They're also getting a little bit more known for the ghost that's there. There is one story in particular that has been in several Haunted Wisconsin books. In 2003, the manager came and opened up the place. It was about 11 o'clock in the morning. He got the bar opened, and then he was seated at the end of the bar reading the morning newspaper. He then claimed that there were 3 unbelievably loud knocks on the front door. Startles him a great deal. He gets up from his stool, a little bit tipped off, went to see who was pounding on the front door. Just as he started to open the door, this very large, very heavy antique ceiling fan that was above him fell from the ceiling and hit the stool he was just on. He then walked outside and he said there was no one within blocks of that tavern. And I believe I have interviewed every bartender who works at Dell's, and they all tell me the same thing. First of all, no one wants to close that bar by themselves. They all told me that. But one told me she was closing by herself. She had just come up from the basement. Just as she reached the top of the steps, the cooler behind the bar where they keep canned beer, the cover opened and closed, banging very loudly 3 times. She told me she was so frightened, she grabbed the keys, went out, locked both exterior doors. She then told me as she was turning the key to the front door, it dawned on her that her car keys were still inside. She then told me she didn't have the courage to go back and get them. She ended up walking home that night. The staff also tell me that when they're closed, sometimes they can very clearly hear people talking or laughter coming out of the restrooms. So clear it makes them think they forgot someone. So they'll check that restroom, find nothing, then they'll come back to the bar, and then they'll hear that laughter start to drift out again. All right, from Dell's, we make our way down 3rd Street, and then we stop at, we have Digger's Sting. That's a very small photograph. And so this is what Digger's Sting used to look like. There was a restaurant there called the Crosse Chop House. So that spot has been a restaurant for a very, very long time. And when the La Crosse Chop House was there, Digger Sting was where Who's on Third is today. The woman who used to own Digger Sting still works there, only during the daytime. And her and the rest of the staff are well acquainted with the ghost that's there. Her more than anyone else, the ghost is her deceased husband, Victor, who used to own the place with her. Now, I've been told the sighting of Victor looks like a mist that comes up from the basement, floats into the kitchen, it then goes into the dining area, it then cuts across to the other side of the restaurant, entering a doorway, which would have been Victor's office at one time. Another indication he is in the building. Just as you go in the front door, off to your left, there's a coat rack with some metal hangers. The staff say the metal hangers will sometimes tinkle together as though someone had just brushed past, even though no one has been in that area. I have yet to talk to an employee who is frightened of Victor when they see something strange. Everyone I talked to, if they saw something strange, their reaction was, okay, everybody, look sharp, the boss is in the building. So Digger's used to be where Who's on Third is today. And that has a very interesting history. That was La Crosse's very first nightclub. Opens up right after Prohibition. So what happened during Prohibition, women did not go to saloons before Prohibition. But then Prohibition hits and you have speakeasies and women start going out and they like it a lot. So once Prohibition is repealed, what happens is the taverns change. It's more conducive to conversation. So you see lots of booze and things like that. And the cocktails are also a big part of it because the liquor during Prohibition was so awful they would have to mix it with other things in order to make it taste okay. So cocktails became popular after Prohibition. So where Who's on Third, that was La Crosse's first nightclub. They had a piano bar in front, and in the back they would feature burlesque dancers. Women would dance on the bar and on a stage in the very back. So where Who's on Third is, that was called the Cloister. That was the nightclub. Now, that's a word that's normally associated with an order of nuns. And I found out that the Franciscan sisters at Viterbo University were not real crazy about their name choice. Every year they existed, the sisters would write them a nice letter saying, please change the name of your business. They never did. If you go to Who's on Third today and go to the back door, you can still see an old floor mat that says the Cloister. That survives to this day. All right. From there, we walk up to 5th Street. And here is it's now the Cavalier Theater and the Cavalier Lounge on the other end there. So, as you well know, that building used to be the La Crosse Community Theater, and it was the community theater for many years. In the mid-'80s, the La Crosse Community Theater did a production of Agnes of God. There are only 3 characters in this play, 3 women. First, there's a young girl who plays a young nun Agnes, a woman who plays a mother superior, and a woman who plays a psychologist. The woman playing the mother superior role had a costume like this one right here. So it's a full hat, so she's got that white cloth surrounding her face. The woman playing this part needed to make an entrance on the right side of the stage. In order to do so in that theater, once you go backstage, there are 3 concrete steps going up, and then there's a dark, narrow passageway that takes you to the other side. She is making this crossing, but she's doing so in character, which means she had her hands tucked inside her costume. I haven't seen old movies. The nuns had their hands inside their hats. I don't know why they do that. But she had her hands inside her costume. She was going up those 3 concrete steps. She caught her foot on the front of her costume, and she began to fall. Because of where her hands were, she couldn't put them down to brace herself. She said just before she hit that hard concrete floor, she felt a pair of strong hands behind her just grab her and stood her straight up. She immediately turns her head to see who had caught her, but when she does that, her face goes into the white cloth of her costume. Plus, it's very dark back there. She didn't see anyone. She just blurted out, "Oh my goodness, thank you," and then went to make her entrance. After the show, she wanted to thank whoever caught her and saved her from breaking her neck. She couldn't find anyone who was back there. The two cast members were on stage at the time. The stage manager was at his post next to the stage, never left it the entire night. The director was in the auditorium the entire evening, and the costume and makeup designer was in the green room the entire night. Now, if you've ever been in a theater production, you know once you eliminate those folks, it's really unlikely anyone would even be allowed to be backstage. And she never did find anyone who was back there. I want to show you what the Cavalier Lounge looked like back in the 40s and 50s. Still is a neat cocktail bar today, but doesn't look anything like this. When the Cavalier looked like this, the owners had brought this young hotshot pianist up from Milwaukee to play some music in the lounge. His name was Walter Lawrence Liberace. He would later drop Walter Lawrence, just become Liberace, and he is one of the more famous people to visit Crosse. All right, from there we make our way down 4th Street, and this is the House Diamond Jewelers parking lot. And the House Diamond Jewelers parking lot is my most favorite historical spot in the city. I'm going to explain why I like it so much. This is what was there. This was a 3-story building that was the parking lot is its footprint. And you see that sign that says Nordstern? That was the name of the German language newspaper that was printed on the 1st floor, along with the La Crosse Chronicle, the English language paper. And the reason why the La Crosse Chronicle's name wasn't on the building was because when this photo was taken, the German language newspaper in La Crosse had a much larger circulation. So Frank, and his nickname is Brick. Frank Brick Pomeroy ran the La Crosse Chronicle during the Civil War. He was an anomaly here in the North. He was a Southern sympathizer, and he hated Abraham Lincoln with a white-hot passion. Back when Lincoln was running for re-election, Brick Pomeroy wrote an editorial in the La Crosse Chronicle that read, and I am quoting, "Abraham Lincoln is allowed to misgovern another 4 years. I trust some bold hand will pierce his heart with a dagger point for the common good." Lincoln wins. A couple of months later, he is assassinated. So the next morning, the editor of the rival newspaper here in La Crosse reprinted Brick Pomeroy's editorial, the one I just told you about, in his newspaper. Brick locked everything up here and went to his house so he could get ready for the mob he knew would come for him that night. And he was right. A mob did form, and they were on their way to his house. Lucky for him, they were intercepted by some city officials and a Catholic priest. They were able to talk everybody into going home that night. The newspaper business was on the 1st floor. On the 2nd and 3rd levels, he built a grand opera house. He went on and on about how beautiful it was. He names it after himself, of course. This is a drawing of what that auditorium looked like. This is from the archives at Murphy Library at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. So that's what was above there, and in 1868, all the seats were filled because Mr. Mark Twain was there speaking. And he was promoting his newly completed The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. At this point, I tell my audience that I know that's not a ghost story, but I will not go by this spot without telling people that Mark Twain was there. I do love to share that story. All right, from there, we make our way down to, that's a small photograph, to the, now, I've been told that it was the bodega lunch counter, but I found out that the owner of the bodega, now he pronounces bodega, so bodega, let's call the whole thing off. So I'll call it the bodega for now. All right, this is Crosse's most well-known ghost story. It gets written about a ton. Lots of magazine articles and newspaper articles and blog posts. Wisconsin Trails magazine included the bodega in its top 10 most haunted places in the state of Wisconsin. It's an old ghost story. It goes all the way back to 1892. That year, the new owner of the business, A.J. Hines, his bedroom window was this one right here. And he claimed that the ghost of the previous owner, Paul Malin, this guy right here, was coming into his bedroom late at night, placing his ghostly hands on his bedpost, and then would shake his bed violently. Paper reported that A.J. Hines would tremble in terror at the thought of having to enter his bedroom, so he did not last too long owning the business. He sold everything and moved out of La Crosse forever. So here is Paul Malin. If we had a close-up, he looks like a nice enough guy, a big guy. I wouldn't want him shaking my bed in the middle of the night. One thing you may notice, for a bartender, that apron is absolutely spotless. So we may theorize he was a bit particular. That's why we're almost certain the ghost at the bodega is the ghost of Paul Malin, because the ghost at the bodega is extremely type A, doesn't like people moving or changing anything. The most famous story was a bartender was working one night. He was down in the basement and he saw far in the corner. There was a stack of street bricks and there was an old board on top. Looked like that junk had been there forever. He went and moved that towards the base of the steps. His plan was to come back with his truck the next day and haul that junk out of there. He is the only one who had a key. The owner was out of town. He came back the next morning, went down into the basement. All the bricks were back where they were, and that board was back on top. And I was told, he decided, hey, that's a good spot for that stuff. I've been told if you hang something new on the walls, no matter how well you've hung it, it will be on the floor by morning. And the ghost doesn't like the bottles they have displayed in the front windows today. Staff tell me those bottles will sometimes shake and vibrate. Whole sections will top over. It usually happens during the daytime when they open. And the doors are not open, and there's no truck passing on the road outside. And if you walk by there, you may notice that oftentimes the bottles are knocked over. Okay, from there we go around to the casino bar. Okay, and this is right when it opened. Again, another bar that opened right after Prohibition. You see those booths, a lot more comfortable, geared towards conversation. In 1932, though, that was Paul Johnston's Barbershop. Paul's wife, Frances, who was 13 years younger than he was, came to him and she said, yeah, I don't really want to be married to you anymore. And then she moves out. Then in September of that year, Paul sees his estranged wife at the racetrack here in town. That is where the UWL football field is today. I'll show you our racetrack. So he sees his estranged wife, and she is with a horse jockey by the name of Billy Smith, and Billy was from St. Paul, Minnesota. He did approach him at the fairgrounds. A few words were exchanged, but nothing really of note. But later that night, it was Billy Smith driving. Frances Johnston was in the passenger seat, and George Stewart and his wife were in the back seat. Somewhere along the line, Frances noticed Paul was behind them, so So she urged Billy to lose him. Well, Billy is from St. Paul. He doesn't know where he's going, and he drives into a dead end. So he put the car in park and got out of the vehicle. Paul pulled in behind him, got out of his car, very calmly walked up to Billy Smith and said, "I told you I was going to get you, and now I've got you." He then pulls a pistol from his jacket and shoots Billy Smith in the chest, killing him instantly. He then turned on Frances, who was still in the car, and fired on her twice. George Stewart got out of the backseat of the car. He made a lunge for the gun. Paul spun around and shot him. He would die from that injury 2 days later. Immediately following, I should mention, Frances did not. She was injured, but she recovered from her injuries. Immediately following the shooting, Paul pulled right up in front of the casino bar and went in, or his barbershop back then, and went inside, and it was there that he called the police. And he calmly told them what he had just done. He ended the conversation very politely. He said, "I'm here at my barbershop. I am waiting for you fellas. I will leave the door open for you." Before the police could arrive, Paul turned his pistol on himself. If you talk to the owner and the staff at the casino bar, they'll tell you that their storage for their liquor and everything is in the basement. So when they're in the basement getting restocked for the next night, sometimes they can very clearly hear someone pacing back and forth on the floor above them. And they all tell me it drives them nuts because it's very clear, and they run up the steps and try and see if someone is messing with them or something like that, but they find nothing, and then they go back downstairs, and then they'll hear those footsteps start up again. Okay, then we start making our way down to the river, and so if you take a ghost tour anywhere in the world, you'll hear stories about 3 types of ghosts. The first type of ghost is an orb. And those are not normally seen by the human eye, but they get captured in photographs and video often. I've seen evidence of an orb. I was leading a tour. There was a gentleman snapping photographs, and he took a picture of an orb on that bridge across the Crosse River. And he sent it to me. It looked a little bit like a speck to me, but he was very excited, so I was too. The next type of ghost is an ectoplasmic mist. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It's a mist. So the ghost at Digger's Stake is an ectoplasmic mist and shares that same characteristics as mists across the globe. A mist always will travel along the same path. And that's what's happening at Digger's Stake. The most common type of ghost is a poltergeist. And they get reported a lot because a poltergeist likes to make noise. And they also like to move things. The ghost at Dell's bar is a poltergeist. The ghost at the bodega is a poltergeist. The rarest type of ghost reported is a full apparition. And the reason why they don't get reported as often as the others is because you may be seeing a ghost and not realize you are seeing a ghost. They look like real people. The little girl at the freight house is a full apparition. We have another example. If you are the building across from the Radisson Hotel, it used to be a toy store recently, and Kick shoe store used to be there. There was a specialty shop called Ambiance. So that building. So the woman who owns that building, her and her husband, they live up on top. And she had a business on that street level. She had retail on the first floor and in the basement, and it was called Ambiance. And she owned that business for about 8 years, and she told me, over the span of owning the business, on 3 separate occasions, she had people come up from the basement and ask if there was a special downtown lacrosse history day because of the woman in the Victorian dress in the basement. She would say, I don't have a woman in a Victorian dress in the basement. Well, they assured her that she did. Interestingly, all three customers described the same person. A woman about 5 feet 6 inches tall. She had a black dress with a high lace collar. Two of the customers said she had a cat with her. Now, her and her husband have lived up on top for many, many years. They told me they have never seen the ghost of a woman in a Victorian dress, but they both told me they definitely saw the ghost of the cat. They were watching television one night, and both of them very plainly saw something run along the side of their place. Well, they have a pet rabbit, so they figured that has to be the culprit. They turned around and they saw that their rabbit was locked in its cage. From there, we make our way down to the river. So this is a photo of Campbell Cemetery. In 1932, a man by the name of Perry Burnstead passes away, and he's a farmhand on a dairy farm outside of town, and he is buried in Campbell Cemetery. It's up near the Quick Trip headquarters, if you're familiar with town, and it's still there. It's actually being swallowed by the Quick Trip headquarters, but it's one of the older cemeteries in town. So Perry is buried. A couple of days later, one of the cemetery attendants noticed that there was something strange about the gravesite, and he urged his boss to look into it. Well, you have to get a court order in order to dig up a grave, so they got the order, dug up his gravesite, opened Perry's coffin, discovered that his body was missing. So it's a banner headline in the La Crosse Tribune that someone had stolen a body from a gravesite, and the city was really buzzing about the news. Body was missing for 9 days. On the 9th day, they found his body. It was behind the Pettibone Beach House. It was in some bushes. It was wrapped in burlap sacks, but Perry's legs had been removed. And they said surgically. The cuts were very precise, definitely done by someone who knew what they were doing. The police did search, but they couldn't locate his legs. So eventually they put him back in his gravesite in Campbell Cemetery, and that was the end of it. Until 1984, there were some paranormal researchers traveling throughout the country, stopping in old cemeteries with sophisticated recording equipment. They came into Campbell Cemetery, made a recording, and then came into the archives of the public library very excited, because when they listened back to their tape, they repeatedly heard a male's voice that said several times, very clearly, "They have cut me up. They cut me up. They have cut me up." Perhaps that was Perry Burnstead still lamenting the loss of his legs. From then, we moved down to, oops, I'll skip that. Okay, we moved down by where the Eaton statue is. And this story begins 1966, 1967 in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, on the banks of the Ohio River. Members of that community over those 2 years reported seeing a large human-like creature, nearly 8 feet tall, with a massive wingspan and large red eyes. It would later be called the Mothman. There were several sightings of the Mothman in Point Pleasant, and then in '67, the Silver Bridge collapses, killing 46 people. After that, no more sightings of the Mothman in Point Pleasant. If you follow the lore, the stories crop up as it moves down the Ohio River. Once it reaches the Mississippi, the stories head to the north. All the stories end in our region. In 2006, a father and son were driving on Briggs Road in Holman. They were driving late at night, and they said a huge creature with a massive wingspan came right in front of their car, nearly striking their windshield. It then backed off and hovered for a bit. Then let out a very strange screech. And it went straight up in the air. As soon as they heard that sound, they both experienced a strange kind of vertigo. The The son who was driving had to throw open his door. He immediately began to get sick. The father would also get sick, and they would both remain ill for about a week. The story did get reported in the La Crosse Tribune, and then several years ago, the cable show Monster Quest came to La Crosse to film an episode. And if you would all like to see a CGI recreation of the story that I just told you, when you get home tonight, search Monster Quest Mothman. The clip that they made for the show will be the first thing that pops up on YouTube. I'd show it to you, but it's pretty long. As an aside, I was asked to tell some ghost stories on Wisconsin Public Radio a couple of years ago. And I told this story. Episode aired in July, and then that fall I was leading a group. We were walking by the Bodega Brew Pub, and this guy came running out of the bar, and he said, "Hey, I heard your Mothman story on the radio. I'm the son." So I was able to get right from the horse's mouth everything that happened that night. It's exactly the way I told you. If you watch the clip, they embellished a little bit for the TV show, but the way I described it is what happened. This is a photo of the Mothman taken on a bridge outside of the Quad Cities. You can see the creature on the side of the bridge, and then on the other side there's an artist rendering of what he might look like. I tell the story in front of the eagle statue, and it was kind of nice to have it there because if you can imagine that eagle statue, the wingspan on the statue, and from eyewitness accounts, the wingspan on the Mothman are about the same. So you have an idea about the size. This is a photo of the Mothman statue that they have in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. They have a Mothman festival there every year. And when I started the tour, I used to joke, I was like, I have no idea what you do at a Mothman festival. But a couple of years ago, I had a woman on the tour who had actually been to it. They have a beer tent. I wish I would have thought of that. They made a movie called The Mothman Prophecy, starring Richard Gere. And the Mothman was also featured in the episode of the TV show The X-Files. So the big question is, why is he here? Sorry, this is so small, but if you look at this map, the cross sits in the middle of the Upper Mississippi Wildlife Refuge. The refuge is enormous. Starts in Barbershop, Minnesota. It goes all the way down to the Quad Cities on the Illinois-Iowa border. In between those 2 points, 242,000 acres of protected land where there really are not a lot of people, and what population that is there, it's in small pockets up and down the river. So if you are a creature who does not wish to be seen, this is a fantastic place to call home, and it seems he's been making his home here for the last 10 to 15 years. I do have some good news. He's not here right now. I follow a lot of interesting Mothman blogs. I do mean interesting. The stories are completely dropped off here. But within the last year and a half, there have been a ton of Mothman sightings outside of Chicago, mostly around O'Hare Airport. There was one about 2 weeks ago. A woman came out of the FedEx building at O'Hare late at night. She described what she thought was a very tall man in a full-length coat. But then it turned around, and again, a very strange screech, and then straight up in the air. Now, the people on the tour, when I shared that story, they always asked, did she get sick? But it wasn't mentioned in the blog post, so I can't answer that for sure. Okay, so there was an eyewitness account with the creature, and this was in Point Pleasant, and they spoke with a sketch artist, and they described what they saw, and this is what the artist drew. So you can see those big wings and then those large red glowing eyes. So that is I ended the tour with that story, and I'm standing right on the banks of the river, right in front of where the eagle statue used to be. And I like to end the tour with a funny story. And then this is a true story. The very first week I was doing the tour, I had 8 people on it, and we were staying on that landing, and it was dark. All 8 people were facing to the north. I was facing to the south. I was telling them about this thing that flies around the area, and from downriver, a great blue heron had come and flew only about 4 feet above everybody's heads, and they all scattered. And at the time, I thought, man, if I can train a heron, this tour is going to be awesome. But yeah, I have no idea how to train a heron. I don't even think it can be done. So that is the end of the tour. I will show you. I've had lots of fun with this. I've met people, lots of tourists. I get a good mix of locals and tourists. What I like about it for tourists is that I'm sharing ghost stories, but I really am slipping in a lot of La Crosse history. And people have a lot of fun with it. This group, they actually made their own homemade Ghostbusters proton packs while we were on the tour. My record for the tour is 71 people. This is them. This was the Viterbo University for their Welcome Back week in the fall. They had arranged for me to do a tour for the students. They said, well, whoever's interested, and they had a little bus. That little bus had to make 6 trips to get everybody there. And let's see, and then I'll just, and then here I am on the banks of the river. Okay, I have about 8 minutes left. Are there any questions at all?
Are you still doing the tour?
I am. Well, actually, this is my last weekend. Halloween night is always my last tour. I will be back next summer. Now, this summer, in years past, I had done them fairly regularly throughout the summer, almost every weekend. This year, I did them just occasionally, but I will be back next summer, I'm sure. So. One thing I do enjoy about the tour is, people tell me ghost stories. We're on the topic, and I love hearing ghost stories. And I'm going to share with one that I don't share on the tour, but it was one that was told to me, and it gives me the chills every time I share it. There was a woman on the tour who was, she was probably close to maybe in her 80s. She was fairly elderly, and I was a little concerned because when we walk a mile, and there is some elevation, going up from Riverside Park up to downtown. So but she was a trooper. She did great. But we end in a different spot than where we start from. So we still end in Riverside Park, but not at the same location. So when we got to the end point, her husband went to go get the car so she wouldn't have to walk that last little bit. And it was just her and I standing on the banks of the river. And she told me the story, and I'm starting to get the chills already. She told me this story. She said that her son had died from an accidental gunshot. And she said she had gotten a call. She was in the kitchen. And she heard the news, and she was in shock. And so she just continued to work in the kitchen, not sure what to do. And then she opened the back door, and she said, I saw my son. He was standing in front of his car. And, it was only for an instant, but she saw his face, and she said he had this look on his face of, Mom, help me. And then he was gone. And they had the funeral, and she said they had a reception afterwards, and then she was in the kitchen again by herself, and she said she heard someone coming up from the basement, and she told me I knew it was him. And I turned around, and she said, I saw my son standing in the doorway, and he didn't say anything to her, but she said it was communicated clearly. He was saying, I'm okay, Mom, everything's fine, don't worry, I'm okay. and then he was gone. So again, you know, this to do this for, you know, people who are visiting La Crosse, I really find they're at the heart of hospitality, because when people share their stories, they're talking about grandparents, you know, or people who have passed that are very, you know, important to them. So it's something you're having a very intimate conversation, you know, with someone that you had just met. So again, I always find these ghost stories so compelling. Well, I want to thank you so much for having me here, and thanks.